On August 21, 2014, Zhang Fan, Liu Yingchun, Zhang Lidong, Zhang Hang and Zhang Qiaolian appeared in court charged with the intentional homicide of Wu Shuoyan, along with charges of being members of an illegal cult organization. With the age of criminal responsibility in China being 14, the 12-year-old boy, referred to with the pseudonym Zhang Mo, couldn't be charged and would later be placed back in the care of his mother, Chen Xiujuan. Of those in court, only Zhang Hang and Zhang Qiaolian displayed remorse for their actions and entered guilty pleas. The remaining trio of Zhang Fan, Liu Yingchun and Zhang Lidong continued to state their innocence, arguing they acted in self-defense while being attacked by an evil spirit. Lawyers representing the defendants also challenged the charges of belonging to an illegal cult organization, stating their clients believed the Church of the Almighty God was an entirely legitimate new religion. They also argued on behalf of their clients that it was impossible to judge which strike was the fatal blow, so the courts couldn't accurately judge which of the defendants was ultimately responsible for ending the life of Wu Shuoyan. While listening to the evidence against her, Zhang Fan was frequently seen smiling, seemingly enjoying both the attention the trial granted her and the opportunity to share her beliefs with the people watching the proceedings. When giving her own testimony, she claimed God had given her the ability to recognize demons, so her actions were fully justified after she identified Wu Shuoyan as an evil spirit. She continued to insist that failure to act in the face of the demonic force would have cost the lives of many more people, so they needed to eliminate the threat. Zhang Fan also demanded to be allowed to read passages from the words appear in the flesh, believing it would help prove her innocence if the court and onlookers present better understood the teachings of the church. She continued to speak ill of her mother Chen Xiujuan, calling her the king of evil spirits, and said she wished she had shattered her rather than expel her from the family home. Zhang Lidong spent the majority of the proceeding showing no emotion and spoke very little, almost as if he wasn't aware of what was taking place around him. What little he said during his testimony largely focused on how he'd submitted completely to the will of God, and followed the words of Zhang Fan and Liu Yingchun unquestioningly. He did, however, give an interview for the television news just prior to the trial. Offering only short answers to the questions asked, he reiterated the belief Wu Shuoyan was an evil spirit, confirmed he was an avid follower of Eastern Lightning, and claimed he felt no fear about receiving the death penalty, thanks to his belief in God. As with Zhang Fan, Liu Yingchun was extremely vocal about stating Wu Shuoyan was an evil demonic force, and talking about the Church of the Almighty God, even going so far as to criticize the organization's founder Zhaoyuan. She openly admitted being the person directing the assault, and ordered Zhang Lidong and Zhang Hang to attack Wu Shuoyan, claiming she saw Zhang Fan being devoured by their victim. While she did admit actively participating in the assault, she claimed she only landed kicks to the victim's body, while the others landed the fatal blows to the head of Wu Shuoyan, albeit at her direction. Liu Yingchun also stated that she was the person who prevented the manager of the McDonald's intervening, and threatened anyone else thinking about getting involved, going on to explain mortals often fail to understand the work they do defeating demons. It appeared that as part of her belief in Eastern Lightning's doctrine she was convinced, thanks to being the firstborn children of their respective families, both she and Zhang Fan were effectively immortal, unless being attacked by evil spirits or being punished by God. She went on to talk about her conviction that only she, Zhang Fan and the rest of her sheep were the true believers following the Church of the Almighty God and the word of the female Christ. When asked about Zhaoyuan, she told the courts that she viewed him as little more than a sect leader, and that his version of Almighty God teachings had developed into a cult. The animosity and disillusionment she felt towards Zhaoyuan and other leaders of the church seemed to stem from her belief they were using the funds generated by the organization for their own enrichment and not for the church's benefit. During the time she and Zhang Fan traveled to other provinces to speak at Church of the Almighty God gatherings, they had both noticed that church leaders didn't seem all that committed to the teachings of the words appear in the flesh, but were very interested in how much money their individual sects made. This was notably the case for a sect almost 1,200 kilometers to the northwest of Zhaoyuan, in the Inner Mongolian city of Baotou, one which Liu Yingchun and Zhang Fan had visited frequently. The two leaders of the sect were arrested for fraud, effectively getting the church shut down. Both Zhang Fan and Zhang Qiaolian fully confessed to their roles during the brutal assault on Wu Shuoyan, and seemingly expressed genuine remorse along with apologizing to the victim's family. The young women both mentioned the shock they felt the previous evening when witnessing Zhang Fan beating the pet dog, something which left them terrified of angering Zhang Fan or Lu Yingchun. However, they refused to use the incident to mitigate their actions. Zhang Qiaolian stated her willingness to compensate the victim's family, giving them part of whatever salary she could earn in the future for as long as it took to satisfy them. On October 11, 2014, Zhang Fan, Lu Yingchun, Zhang Lidong, Zhang Hang and Zhang Qiaolian appeared in court once more to hear the verdict against them and discover their punishments. Ultimately, the court rejected their claim of self-defense, saying accusing Wu Shuoyan of being an evil demonic spirit had no scientific basis to support it. They also dismissed the lawyer's defense of not knowing which of the group actually ended the life of Wu Shuoyan, saying all played an active role during the beating and thus contributed to her demise. The defendants were all found guilty of intentional homicide, along with being part of an illegal cult organization. Having admitted her guilt, shown genuine remorse, and offered to compensate the victim's family, Zhang Qiaolian was sentenced to 7 years in prison, the court deciding she was an accomplice to the crime who wasn't fully in control of her actions thanks to the influence Zhang Fan and Lu Yingchun held over her. Due to her age, having been indoctrinated into what the courts described as a cult organization, fully confessing to the crime and showing remorse, Zhang Hang was sentenced to 10 years in prison, it being decided that she too couldn't be held fully responsible for her actions. Zhang Lidong, however, received no mercy from the judiciary. His refusal to accept any guilt and complete lack of remorse saw him handed the death penalty. It was the same story for his eldest daughter Zhang Fan, who was handed the death penalty for the intentional homicide of Wu Shuoyan. The sentence handed to Lu Yingchun, however, would be surrounded by controversy once it was announced. Despite refusing to admit her guilt, showing no remorse in both participating in and directing the attack on Wu Shuoyan, she escaped the death penalty and was sentenced to life in prison. While the victim's family accepted the sentences handed to Zhang Hang and Zhang Qiaolian, they were shocked and angered by what they perceived as an unreasonably light punishment given to Lu Yingchun and immediately lodged an official protest. Shortly after the sentences were announced, the lawyers representing the 5 defendants entered appeals on their behalf, further angering the victim's family. On November 10, 2014, just 2 weeks before the result of the appeals were set to be heard, the husband of Wu Shuoyan, Jin Zhongqing, announced the family were withdrawing their protest against the punishment handed to Lu Yingchun. While he didn't go into detail, he stated that after the reason for the sentence was explained to him, he agreed to accept the verdict and viewed the matter closed. On November 28, 2014, it was announced the appeals made by the defendants' lawyers were rejected, and the punishments were upheld. On February 2, 2015, Zhang Fan and Zhang Lidong made their final court appearance to hear their punishment was set to be carried out that day. Moments later they were taken away and executed for the intentional homicide of Wu Shuoyan. The video showing the vicious assault going viral online brought with it a lot of unwanted attention to the Church of the Almighty God, who are now operating internationally in numerous countries. The negative attention was something the still secretive group desperately wanted to avoid. However, with the international media covering the story, spokespersons for the church were forced to make a rare public statement. The now New York-based headquarters of the church, having established itself in the United States 14 years prior, distanced the organization from the group responsible for the demise of Wu Shuoyan, stating they were nothing more than psychopaths that had nothing to do with the church or its teachings. The arrest and imprisonment of Zhao Weishan in 1997 did little to stop the growth of Eastern Lightning over the subsequent years. On the contrary, the period was one of significant expansion under the leadership of the man Zhao Weishan left in charge, He Zhexun. Also going under the false identity Luo Gang, He Zhexun had been a follower of Zhao Weishan since the days of the Yongyuan True God Church in Heilongjiang, coming to Henan in 1992, and was trusted enough to manage the organization's finances. While the spread of Eastern Lightning took place mainly in Henan and other neighboring northern provinces, while Zhao Weishan was in control, He Zhexun displayed more ambition, sending missionaries further south into the east with orders to establish new churches in more prosperous areas. Under his management, the group expanded into the provinces of Zhejiang, Hubei, Hunan, Jiangxi, 福建、广东 and 广西 ，adding to their already established presence in 河南、河北、山西、安徽、山东、陕西、黑龙江、辽宁 and 吉林。He also began targeting a much wider variety of persons to become followers of the movement. Up to this point, the organization largely targeted the elderly and women, but He Zhaoyuan saw value in convincing men who had less than savory reputations to become followers, creating a role for them he termed the protectors. The protectors traveled with the largely female missionaries to watch over them as they tried to convert potential new members, along with helping to strongly convince followers who expressed doubts about the church's teachings to remain with the organization. In 1998, the protectors made their presence felt when two men who had taken the position with the organization would bring the attention of the authorities back onto the church. Between October 30th and November 10th, villages around the Nanyang area of Henan were terrorized by an Eastern Lightning missionary and the two men acting as her protectors. The trio began attending local churches and speaking to members of the congregations about their new movement, saying the traditional Bible was outdated and that Christ had returned. They added that the end of days was coming, and only those loyal to the Christ made flesh would be saved when the 7 plagues descended from heaven. If people were receptive to their beliefs, the group were extremely enthusiastic and talkative. However, their attitude changed to being hostile and aggressive if people dismissed them. One of the people who rudely rejected the idea of the female Christ was farmer Liu Shuhai. On October 30th, he was returning to his home in Miying village in Tanghe County when he was accosted by the missionary and her protectors. Steadfastly continuing to reject the church's doctrine, the men knocked him to the ground and began beating his legs with iron bars until both the farmer's legs were broken. The following evening on October 31st, employee of the Tanghe Zangang Township Water Company, Xu Chunsun, answered to someone knocking at his door and was met with the Church of the Almighty God representatives, wanting to speak with him about the female Christ. He politely invited the trio into his home, where they began trying to convince him to join the church. However, unlike some of the other people in the area, Xu Chunsun had heard of the group before, and once he realized who they represented, told the missionary and her protectors that he wasn't interested in joining what he called a heretical cult. In response, one of the protectors hit Xu Chunsun over the head with an iron rod, knocking him to the ground, before both men broke his legs while he lay injured and defenseless. The group then searched the man's home and took any money they found lying around and left the scene. 2 days later, on November 2nd, 40 kilometers away in Caozhuang village, the trio entered the home of 73-year-old villager Zhang Yunfu, where a similar scene played out. The old man rejected the idea of joining Eastern Lightning and demanded the people leave his home. Once again, the protectors attacked with blows from iron rods to the legs, but this time also removed the right ear of Zhang Yunfu, telling him this was punishment for not listening to the teachings of the Church of the Almighty God. Again, the group ransacked the victim's home, taking anything of value they could find from the poor farmer, before fleeing the scene. On November 6th, this time 14 kilometers to the north in Jinzhuang village, located in the neighboring Sheqi County, the trio were invited into the home of villager Bao Xinpeng. The visit resulted with Bao Xinpeng having both legs broken and an ear removed after dismissing what the visitors had to say. Once again, after injuring the victim, the trio took any money or other valuables they could find, suggesting that perhaps their reason for attacking people wasn't only because they rejected the church. There would be 2 more assaults and robberies during the following days, taking place in different villages. The first occurred on November 7th, in Changzhuang village, 11 kilometers to the east of the location the previous attack took place. Elderly female resident of the village Li Zhirong saw her legs being broken before she was robbed of any money she had by 3 people who visited her, wanting to speak about Eastern Lightning. The trio then attacked and robbed farmer Wang Qinpan on November 10th while he walked home from selling some of his crops in Qingtai Township, once again leaving the victim with broken legs and taking his money. Shortly after the final robbery, the 2 male protectors Liu Shunting and Zhao Fating were tracked down and arrested, both men local to the Nanyang area. The female missionary they accompanied, however, managed to evade capture, both protectors claiming they didn't know the woman's full name and were only able to give police the family name Ding, which did little to help investigators narrow down a list of suspects. After giving police everything they knew about the church and naming other members, on March 7, 2000, the men appeared in court to receive their punishments. Liu Shunting received an 18-year prison sentence, while Zhao Fating was handed 17 years in prison. Only weeks after the convictions of the two protectors, Zhao Weishan completed his own prison sentence and was released, but seemingly not rehabilitated. Since the attacks in Nanyang, and thanks to information provided by the two protectors, the police had cracked down hard on the group, leaving Zhao Weishan believing he would likely become a target for the authorities once more. With his loyal follower He Zhexun proving himself an extremely capable manager of the organization during his absence, Zhao Weishan decided to leave China with Yang Xiangbin, and another secret he kept from his followers, the son he'd reportedly had with the female Christ. Something which was knowledge only the highest-ranking members of the church were privy to was Zhao Weishan and Yang Xiangbin having an intimate relationship since first meeting when she was just 18 and he was 40. Just prior to the arrest of Zhao Weishan, Yang Xiangbin gave birth to their son Zhao Ming, with the few people aware of this being told they faced the most severe punishment if they shared the information with anyone, saying talking of God's flesh was extreme blasphemy. Zhao Weishan set about following the example of the person who inspired his supposed religious awakening, Witness Li, by deciding to relocate to the USA and trying to establish the church overseas. Connecting with groups which had similar reputations to Eastern Lightning in both Japan and America, Zhao Weishan got advice about how to get into the United States. He first got new identities for himself, Yang Xiangbin and 5 other key members of the church. The high priest Zhao Weishan would become known as Xu Wenshan on any official documents. Going forward, the supposed female Christ Yang Xiangbin would be known under the name Wang Yurong. With the false identities, which also saw them alter their ages, they applied for passports, which were granted without issue. The new identities would also allow them to do something which would somewhat backfire, and expose the part of their relationship they tried to keep hidden. Wanting to keep the fact they were essentially husband and wife with child, they didn't get an official marriage paper. However, with their new names, they felt comfortable enough to get legally married. This left an official marriage certificate, which is required to have a photo showing the happy couple together. Once the authorities discovered the false identities obtained by Zhao Weishan, they were able to publish the marriage certificate photo exposing the true nature of their relationship. Naturally, the organization would later deny the validity of the photo, claiming it was fake propaganda to smear the good name of Zhao Weishan and the female Christ. Along with the false identities, Zhao Weishan gave himself Yang Xiangbin and the 5 other members of the church set to leave China with them, fake but very official-sounding employment positions to help obtain visas. The false identity of Zhao Weishan, Xu Wenshan, claimed he was employed as the Shangshui County Agricultural Science and Technology Service Center Director, while Yang Xiangbin, now using the name Wang Yurong, was the director of the Lushan County Agricultural Committee. The 5 other members of the church who received false identities were given fake positions as engineers or general managers under the employment of either Zhao Weishan or Yang Xiangbin. In the May of the year 2000, Zhao Weishan contacted the U.S. Federal Trade Commission to obtain a business invitation letter under the pretext of visiting the country to discuss future agricultural development, which was subsequently granted. In the September of the year 2000, the group using false identities arrived in the United States of America, first flying from Shanghai to Tokyo, where they met with members of the similar organization who'd advised Zhao Weishan on how to gain entry into the States. They then flew from Tokyo and ultimately made their way to New York, where they were helped by another organization, which had already done the same thing, with establishing a headquarters, believed to be located in the Flushing area of the city. The Flushing area was chosen as Zhao Weishan had made contacts among the large Chinese community residing there, people prepared to house the high priest, the female Christ and the other 5 people traveling with them. As the group settled in New York, one of those using false identities was tasked with bringing the 6-year-old son of Zhao Weishan and Yang Xiangbin to America. The woman later identified as Wu Xia, who had effectively been serving as the boy's nanny throughout his childhood, made several trips back and forth between the US and China, putting everything in place. In the meantime, Zhao Weishan and the others got on with the task of establishing their presence in their new home, setting up the website godwork.org, and printing copies of the organization's writings to share among the New York Chinese community. They eventually got false documents for Zhao Ming, allowing them to obtain a passport, changing the boy's name from Zhao Ming to Xu Tianbao, and in the December of 2001, the child was granted a visa for entry into America under the guise of visiting relatives. Months prior to his son entering the United States, Zhao Weishan had taken steps to ensure that he, Yang Xiangbin, and those that followed them could stay in America on a more permanent basis. Following advice from others who'd taken the same steps, all those that traveled to New York made an application to be granted political asylum using the pretext that they were fleeing religious persecution. They claimed that they were the founders and members of a small local Christian church which the Chinese government was trying to shut down. The applications were accepted, and ultimately they would reportedly be given citizenship. The name the Church of the Almighty God, or Eastern Lightning, had remained largely under the radar outside China, but soon the organization started gaining followers in the US, before making inroads into other countries, including Canada, Australia, Korea, Japan, and Indonesia. While this was happening, in China the church saw its largest expansion under the leadership of He Zhexun, establishing sects in almost every province, and growing from thousands of members to over 1 million. Zhao Weishan, in constant communication with He Zhexun via mail, outlined 8 more refined methods to convince people to join the church than previously used, which missionaries, along with the protectors, were taught in order to follow. In what they termed paving the way, the particular method employed depended on the identity and circumstances of the potential target, with both men agreeing they should cast the organization's net over a much wider demographic when looking to recruit people. The first method was to display good knowledge of the traditional Bible when speaking to possible converts, giving the impression they were true Christians, but to then slowly start pointing out possible fallacies and introduce Eastern Lightning's interpretation. This technique was largely focused on targeting people who were new to local churches and had little knowledge of the scriptures. The second was using deception. Followers were told to not tell potential new recruits they were believers in the Church of the Almighty God's teachings, and flatly deny they were members if challenged. By now the organization had several books detailing their belief, which didn't use the name Eastern Lightning or Church of Almighty God. The words appear in the flesh would only be introduced once people had shown serious interest in the teachings of the other books. This was a tactic generally used when followers were attempting to convert relatives, colleagues, or close friends. The third amounted to little more than bribery, and was to display an extremely generous nature, along with flattering people. Zhao Weishan personally found doing this helped the movement grow during the early days of the Yongyuan True God Church. When he began holding gatherings in his family home, he always made sure there was an abundance of food on offer for attendees, going out of his way to provide things the usually poor followers otherwise had little opportunity to enjoy. The treats on offer kept people coming back, even if they initially displayed little interest in the teachings, and gradually the attendees fell under the church's influence. Now recruiters were told to flatter people, especially when it came to knowledge of Christian doctrine, and tell them they'd be an excellent addition to the church, offer gifts for little reason, and even help people out financially if they were struggling with small debts. In some cases people found themselves duped into attending gatherings by supposed friends telling them they were going to attend a retreat in a different province, and after inviting them to the event they offered to cover the friends' travel and accommodation costs if they went along. The unsuspecting friends then found themselves attending church gatherings, and felt they had little choice other than to participate in the activities, repaying the kindness shown to them. The fourth method was to infiltrate local churches. While they had done this before, the rather brute force manner of doing so had resulted in unwanted police attention, so now followers were told to be more subtle and play the long game. Eastern Lightning missionaries were told to act like a believer in whatever the particular church they attended preached, and slowly gain friends. They were ordered to try and discover the financial situation of other attendees, and target people who appeared to have money, or to get gossip that could later be used to blackmail people into converting. When it was felt they were suitably ensconced in the community, they would gradually begin questioning and attacking the reputations of the church leaders, pulling people to their own true beliefs in the process. The fifth technique was to always be enthusiastic and positive when talking about God. followers would tell people about their experiences with the Lord, describing how it helped them overcome problems and was the reason for the positive personality they displayed. This was employed generally when meeting new people, the missionaries being told to create false identities with made-up stories about overcoming tragedy, or beautiful tales illustrating how God repaid their belief. The targets in this case were largely people who suffered hardships in life, such as abusive relationships, and more notably, those who'd experienced serious health issues. When talking to people with health issues, the Eastern Lightning missionary would have remarkably been through the same issue, and explained God helped cure them. Their enthusiasm and miraculous tales soon saw people gain interest in the individual's church, and the God who'd supposedly rewarded their faith. The sixth method, one the organization used the protectors to perform, saw the church hit the headlines across China once more. It amounted to effectively kidnapping and holding pastors of local churches hostage, attempting to strong-arm them into preaching Church of the Almighty God doctrine to their flocks. In 2002, 34 pastors located in various cities around the country representing legitimate local churches found themselves being held hostage by members of Eastern Lightning, who demanded they either began preaching the word of Church of the Almighty God or handed over control of the church to them entirely. The pastors had been invited to attend what they thought were genuine gatherings of leaders from different local church organizations, but when arriving at the locations of the supposed meetings, they were forcibly prevented from leaving. They were held hostage for varying periods of time, the shortest being 20 days, while the longest was 2 months. The incident appeared to be highly coordinated, with the 34 local church leaders being essentially kidnapped around the same time. In the aftermath, only a handful of those held in captivity were prepared to speak publicly about the experience, others too scared of reprisals from Eastern Lightning followers. One pastor eventually released described Eastern Lightning as a criminal group that only used Christianity to hide the real motivations behind the leaders of the supposed church. Another described the abusive treatment he received, leading him to go on hunger strike in efforts to force his captors to release him or risk his passing away. Prior to his decision to stop eating, he'd been subjected to regular beatings, deprived of sleep, and forced to listen to the songs of Eastern Lightning on repeat. After 3 days of him refusing anything to eat or drink, the protectors introduced a female missionary who brought food and begged him to eat, along with trying to tempt the pastor in other ways. Realizing the pastor wasn't going to break the hunger strike, his captors eventually decided they had little other option but to release him. The incident caused another crackdown on the supposed church, leading to numerous arrests, but the leaders managed to escape being detained thanks to the followers doing everything they could to protect the organization's senior members. Another method used by the protectors was to dress as police officers and visit the homes of people who attended local churches. They would question the people about their religious beliefs, then arrest them for attending an illegal local church. Rather than being taken to a police station, those supposedly arrested found themselves being held in isolated homes, where missionaries attempted to convert them to Eastern Lightning or to make a financial contribution to the church. The seventh technique used was to stage fake exorcisms of demons to show the true power of Church of Almighty God followers. Largely taking place in rural regions, one Eastern Lightning follower living among the community would begin to act as though possessed by an evil demonic spirit. They'd make very public displays of the supposed possession, falling to the ground, rolling around, screaming and shouting nonsense when among people. A second Eastern Lightning follower and friend of the supposedly possessed individual would then tell villagers they knew a preacher who could help cast out the evil spirit. The preacher, another Eastern Lightning member, arrived in the village and performed the exorcism in front of the villagers, miraculously curing the afflicted person. The exorcist then began preaching that the female Christ had given them the power to fight demons and protect the innocent. Seeing the miraculous work and recovery of the possessed individual, people grew an interest in the church the preacher represented. The eighth and final main technique employed to get people to join Eastern Lightning was one largely aimed at getting more men to join the church. It also went some way to explain the reason Lu Yingchun and Zhang Fan appeared so keen to indoctrinate Zhang Hang into being a committed believer, with female members of the church being told offering their bodies to potential male members was doing God's work, like with the case of Zhang Qiaolian, even going so far as to offer to marry the men if needed. Women frequently made up the majority of congregations for most local churches, and from the early days of the Yongyuan True God Church, Zhao Weishan had made a point of targeting women to join his movement. There were various aspects of the traditional culture at the time which made it easier for groups like the Church of the Almighty God to appeal to women. Generally, after marriage, the woman would move away from her own family and friends, going to reside in her husband's family home, where they'd frequently be expected to act as homemakers while the men went out to work. With poverty-stricken provinces like Henan having few prospects for people to earn money, many moved away to the southern or east coast provinces, where there had been massive levels of investment and a flood of foreign companies setting up manufacturing bases providing jobs. It was extremely common for the husbands to move thousands of kilometers from their hometowns to other provinces and developing industrial cities like Foshan, Shenzhen and Guangzhou, having found work, leaving behind the wives to raise their children and take care of their in-laws. This often left the wives with little time to visit their own families or friends, especially in rural areas with few public transport options, and prior to the widespread use of cell phones, not much chance of even being able to contact them. In some cases, the marriages were effectively arranged between families, with the bride and groom not knowing each other especially well or never actually meeting beforehand, meaning the wife had little emotional connection to her new family. The husbands would only return home during major festivals, leaving the wives feeling isolated and lacking a sense of fitting in, now living among close-knit communities as an outsider. The local churches were welcoming to newcomers and offered an environment where many had similar experiences and issues, making the women feel a comforting sense of community. However, there was another aspect of the culture which also made women appealing targets to local churches that perhaps didn't have the best intentions. With the wife being in charge of the home, part of those duties included managing the family finances, which meant the husbands were expected to hand over the bulk of their salaries to the wife every month. For organizations which were, if not outright demanding financial contributions from followers, then heavily pushing them to donate to the church, having the people managing a family's money was extremely attractive. There was then almost inevitably another reason for less than reputable local church organizations targeting women. The leaders of the churches were overwhelmingly male, who perhaps enjoyed having an enormous amount of influence over their largely female congregation. The ex-wife of Zhao Weishan, Fu Yunzhi, made it extremely clear the reason the marriage fell apart was thanks to her ex-husband abusing his position and initiating intimate relationships with his original female Christ, Dou Yanqiu, along with at least 2 other senior members of the church, both much younger than Zhao Weishan. In efforts to attract a wider demographic of followers, female believers were reportedly told they needed to help seduce men into joining the organization. Both married and unmarried men were equally targeted, the married men being excellent for blackmail opportunities. There were also cases where women offered themselves or their own daughters as wives to men who for various reasons were unable to find a wife or girlfriend for themselves. The refined paving the way recruitment techniques worked out by Zhao Weishan and He Zhexun saw the church expand massively across mainland China and begin to gain followings among Chinese communities overseas. By the early 2000s, it was estimated that membership of the church in mainland China alone had grown to around 2 million followers, with believers in multiple sections of society. Wider use of the internet had made it easier for believers to recruit new followers anonymously, setting up groups on early internet forums to share the teachings of the female Christ. There were now university students, businessmen, and even local government employees joining the church. Some, like Zhang Lidong, gradually got taken in by the teachings in the words appear in the flesh, becoming genuine believers, but also others who helped finance the church thanks to being blackmailed by sect leaders. It was said that after Zhao Weishan fled to the United States, the group was earning over 10 million yuan, 1.5 million USD annually, from the mainland Chinese operation alone, the bulk of which found its way to Zhao Weishan and Yang Xiangbin in the United States. The money was coming from direct donations offered by followers, and selling the various books, CDs, DVDs, and other material being produced by the church. Followers were given recruitment targets, and expected to purchase the materials being produced by the high priest and female Christ to sell to new recruits, earning commission for the sales and bringing new people into the church. By meeting the targets set by the church leaders, followers rose to higher positions in the organization, eventually earning the title Firstborn Son of God, as Liu Yingchun managed to achieve, just one step down from being a church leader. The structure of the nationwide sects had a number of levels, beginning with the female Christ and the high priest Zhaoyuan, who oversaw the management of the entire organization. Now the group was going international. There needed to be an individual acting as national manager in the different countries, with He Zhexun filling the role in mainland China. Under him, each separate province would have their own provincial branch leader, who was in charge of the people managing each individual district and county in their particular province. The people under the district and county level leaders were then divided into urban and rural area management for the individual cities and townships. The actual churches following the teachings of Zhaoyuan and the female Christ were structured in an extremely similar manner. Being overseen by either the urban or rural managers, at the top were the preachers, responsible for hosting gatherings, educating people on Eastern Lightning doctrine, and passing on sales and recruitment targets from the management. The second tier were the firstborn sons, the top performers in their particular church, whom the words appear in the flesh claimed had been perfected by the female Christ's teachings, which granted them the power to chastise, curse, along with the right to eventually reign alongside the Christ made flesh. Both Liu Yingchun and Zhang Fan reached this level, Liu Yingchun many years prior to recruiting her disciple, and Zhang Fan after bringing her family, especially her father, into the organization. Those in the third tier were simply called sons. The sons were said to be sinners before they joined the church, but by meeting the standards they were set by firstborn sons and showing total obedience to the word of the female Christ, they had been cleansed. Thanks to his total obedience to both Liu Yingchun and eldest daughter Zhang Fan, transferring millions over to them without question, Zhang Lidong managed to reach this level before his arrest. The next tier were referred to as the people, generally newcomers to the church who hadn't yet met the standards expected by the female Christ. They hadn't made any major contribution to the church, and still had questions about the doctrine laid out in the group's scriptures. Zhang Qiaolian was considered as belonging to the people tier, until she agreed to provide intimate companionship to Zhang Lidong. Those in the final tier were referred to as servants. They were people who were initially attracted to the church for reasons other than the supposed religious teachings. Part of the shift to targeting a wider demographic included not just talking about the group's doctrine, but also offering people the opportunity to make money. Followers now began speaking to potential new recruits about the extra income they made from the commission received from selling the group's materials, and how it was a great opportunity to get rich. With the possibility of earning easy money, people began attending gatherings, and almost inevitably after seeing the most devout followers had the most success, they gradually fell into following the church's teachings. The servants were also people like Zhang Hang, those who proved difficult to fully convert, and displayed a stubbornness in accepting the female Christ's word. They tended to be family members of believers who had little interest in the religion. With Zhang Hang proving difficult to fully indoctrinate, she was largely considered as belonging to the people tier, until she told Liu Yingchun and Zhang Fan about her mother, telling her to leave the home. The church referred to anyone refusing to accept the teachings of the female Christ with the name, the perishing, and these people were considered the sons and daughters of Satan. In the minds of the church's most devout followers, the perishing were evil demonic spirits, trying to tempt people away from the church or destroy them. Tragically for Wu Shuoyan, especially fanatical followers of Eastern Lightning considered her one of the perishing after she refused to give them her phone number, and it was decided she must be stopped. In 2007, there was an extremely significant change surrounding the mainland China operation, with long-time loyal follower and the head of the organization in the country He Zhexun being fired by Zhaoyuan. Perhaps inevitably, it appeared the falling out between the two men wasn't over ideological differences but rather the organization's finances and how they were being handled. The mainland Chinese network was still by far bringing in the most money, and He Zhexun was charged with transferring the tens of millions the group was making annually to Zhaoyuan in the United States. With China being somewhat strict about currency leaving the country and the church being considered an illegal cult, the group used 3 clandestine methods to move it. The first being through fake foreign businesses mostly established by district-level managers who were told they could only keep a maximum of 500,000 yuan, around 71,000 USD at any time to fund church activities. The rest needed to be sent to America and Zhaoyuan. The next was using 地下钱庄, meaning illegal underground banks, which already served certain Chinese organizations that also operated overseas, trying to avoid the attention of the authorities both at home and abroad. Eastern Lightning reportedly only used 3 illegal banks located in the provinces of Anhui, Jiangsu and Guangdong. The third was perhaps the most basic, in that higher-level members of Eastern Lightning would simply carry the cash with them when traveling to America, supposedly for business purposes or visiting relatives. The mules always made sure to carry just enough so that it wouldn't ring any alarm bells when entering the country, and then handed it over to members of the organization in the States. Initially, Zhaoyuan reportedly ordered He Zhexun to transfer money every 6 months, the amount generally around 1 million yuan, slightly over 140,000 USD each time. However, by 2007, Zhaoyuan suddenly and dramatically increased the amount he wanted sending with each transfer. The money the group was earning was growing with each passing year as more people joined the church, and it appeared he became worried He Zhexun may find the temptation to siphon off some of the money for himself too much to turn down. Zhaoyuan began demanding that He Zhexun send 20 million yuan, almost 3 million USD each transfer, using the 3 methods to do so. In response, He Zhexun tried to argue that transferring such a significant amount was far too great a risk, and that with the group continuing to gain members across China, more should be kept domestically to fund further expansion. In the October of 2007, He Zhexun was dismissed from being head of the Chinese mainland operation. Then in 2009, during a crackdown on the church's activities, he along with 120 other high-ranking members of the church were arrested. At the time, he was one of the longest-serving members of the Church of the Almighty God the authorities had detained, so he was very much a prize catch. He gave police vital information about the structure of the organization and how it managed its finances. However, unlike other Eastern Lightning members police had arrested over the years, he seemingly had little interest in the church's doctrine, viewing himself more like a CEO than fanatic. He also went into detail about how he communicated with Zhaoyuan over the years, saying that once email use became widespread across China, it allowed them to remain in constant contact, with Zhaoyuan changing his email address on a monthly basis. In 2005, it seemed Zhaoyuan became a touch more paranoid about the authorities intercepting his communications, so began changing his email address every week. Towards the end of 2009, He Zhexun received a 15-year prison sentence for his activities related to his work for the Church of the Almighty God. Despite the group's best efforts to remain under the authorities' radar, it continually gained unwanted attention, thanks to various violent or tragic incidents involving its followers, leading to regular crackdowns on the group. A combination of followers being especially secretive about their membership to those around them, and people's fear of suffering repercussions if they reported someone they suspected of belonging to the group to the police. The authorities were only able to shut down churches if something exposed them. Sometimes it would be families reporting a relative as missing, other times if a relative had been cheated out of their money, but often the incidents involved loss of life. In some cases, people attempted to or were successful in taking their own lives, believing that doing so would help them ascend into heaven. In other cases, believers hurt or ended the lives of family members after people fell out over the fanatical religious belief that seemingly had an ability to completely consume the follower's life. Furthermore, hundreds of people, overwhelmingly female followers of the Church of the Almighty God, have been reported missing, seemingly vanishing without trace, leaving the families never hearing from them again. While the tragic incidents tended to happen sporadically, from around 2010 onwards there was a notable increase in violent incidents involving believers of the Church of the Almighty God, largely thanks to the organization informing its followers when the world was going to end. With mankind now being in the age of kingdom, the Church had long told its followers the end of days was coming, and they, as many other similar groups did, used the Mayan calendar to claim the apocalypse was coming in December 2012. The group would use two things to help make its followers believe the end times were near. One was the 2009 Roland Emmerich-directed movie 2012, starring John Cusack. The film was played at gatherings, the church saying it was showing what was going to happen in only a few years' time. The second was a major natural disaster, which had taken place the year prior, in 2008. In the afternoon of May 12, Sichuan province experienced a massive earthquake, measured at 7.9 on the Richter scale. The epicenter was located in the county of Wenchuan, around 80 kilometers to the northwest of the province's capital city Chengdu. The earthquake caused massive devastation in the region, with almost 70,000 people losing their lives, close to 380,000 people being injured, and around 20,000 being reported missing in the days after the quake. Tremors were felt in almost every Chinese province, and several neighboring countries. The disaster destroyed entire villages and townships, especially areas with old, poorly constructed homes. School buildings full of students collapsed, leading to numerous construction company bosses being arrested for using cheap building materials to save money. At Church of Almighty God meetings, followers were shown footage of the damage done to the region and the subsequent rescue efforts. When people were pulled from the rubble alive, the leaders told followers it was thanks to the female Christ saving them because they were true believers. However, when bodies were uncovered, the followers were told it was punishment for rejecting the church. Fully believing the end was coming, believers began stockpiling food and other essentials to survive the apocalypse before ascending into heaven. Furthermore, the fear followers felt saw a massive increase in donations being made to the church, along with people purchasing items. Zhaoyuan began selling to help believers get into heaven. What he called his Noah's Ark tickets sold for anything between 1.5 million yuan to 5 million yuan, 215,000 to 715,000 USD. Also, for the first time since starting the Yongyuan True God Church in the 1980s, Zhaoyuan reportedly gave the order for the church to go public and perform mass demonstrations in the streets. In the December of 2012, Eastern Lightning followers marched across hundreds of cities around the country, informing people the world was about to end. Church leaders attempted to preach to the general public about the teachings of the church, telling the people the only way to be saved was to join Eastern Lightning and pledge loyalty to the Christ made flesh. Some of the demonstrations turned violent, Church of the Almighty God followers clashing with members of the public who rubbished their beliefs, and the police who were trying to get the demonstrators to clear the streets. The December of 2012 also saw a notable violent incident involving an Eastern Lightning believer, just days after the demonstrations took place. In the Henan province county Guangshan, 36-year-old unemployed Mi Yongjun approached the gates of the local primary school as students arrived to start the school day. Suffering from severe epilepsy in an area which had little understanding of the condition, referring to it with the term pig madness, Mi Yongjun had struggled to gain regular employment throughout his adult life. His parents took him to hospitals in the cities of Beijing, Wuhan and Shanghai, hoping that the condition would be cured, and eventually he was given medication to help control the issue, allowing him to experience a fairly normal life for a period of time. Despite his health issues, the stigma around them, and struggles to earn a living, he was married with 2 daughters. His wife supported the family, working in another province, while his parents generally took care of the 2 girls. At the beginning of 2012, the condition of Mi Yongjun worsened, with his seizures becoming more frequent, seemingly without explanation. Early in the morning of December 14th, Mi Yongjun forced his way into the home of an 85-year-old villager and physically assaulted the elderly woman. He then stole a knife from the kitchen and made his way to the village primary school. On reaching the school gate, he immediately began slashing at anyone he saw, injuring several students before sprinting into the campus. While some students ran out of the school to raise the alarm, remarkably others began arming themselves with whatever they found lying around and gave chase, shouting warnings to other students and the school staff. With students flooding out of the school gate shouting for help, villagers quickly made their way to the scene and began searching for the knifeman wandering the campus. While Mi Yongjun continued to prowl the school slashing at any student he could get close to, teachers and students began barricading classroom doors to prevent him from entering. Once a group of armed teachers and villagers caught up with him, he began running to leave the scene, with the furious villagers giving chase. Running into the village, residents managed to stop Mi Yongjun and get him under control, dishing out a little of their own form of justice before police arrived and saved him from the angry mob. First being transported to hospital to get treatment for the injuries inflicted during the citizen's arrest, Mi Yongjun was then taken to the nearest police station and interrogated. His 3-minute spree left 22 students and 1 teacher injured. Fortunately, however, there would be no loss of life. During the interrogation, Mi Yongjun told police he needed to do something because the apocalypse was imminent, and that 72 days of catastrophe was ahead of them. His father claimed that the previous evening Mi Yongjun left the family home around midnight, raving about the end of the world and that thunder and lightning were going to end his life, so he needed to take lives to protect himself. Unfortunately, his father failed to take his son's words seriously, considering it just one more strange thing Mi Yongjun had been talking about over the course of the previous year, and put it down to his son's seemingly worsening condition. Mi Yongjun had been ranting for months that Henan province was going to be razed, and the end of the world was near. He had even beaten his children and parents when displaying the apparent mania. It later emerged that he'd frequently been speaking with another villager, who was a committed follower of the Church of the Almighty God. 60-year-old Jin Guozhu shared the teachings of the female Christ with him, filling his head with the idea of the world coming to an end, and that only believers would get to heaven. She had also advised him to stop taking his medication and pray to the female Christ instead, so that his mind wasn't altered when the end times came. Seeing the public demonstrations by followers of Eastern Lightning convinced him the apocalypse was coming, so he needed to take action. In order to guarantee his ferry ticket into heaven, he took inspiration from another tragic incident that occurred in the province the previous year, which was widely reported by the local media. On January 10, 2011, 330 kilometers to the north of Guangshan, in Lankao County, an Eastern Lightning follower ended the life of her 2-month-old daughter. Li Guirong had joined her local sect in 2003, and her success with bringing new members into the church and selling Church of Almighty God material saw her rise through the ranks, reaching the position of being a firstborn son of God. However, when she became pregnant, she was unable to commit as much time to the church, and consequently she was demoted, returning to the position of son. Questioning the leader of her sect about the reason for her demotion, she was told it was because of the child keeping her away from the church. Li Guirong came to the conclusion that the child was in reality an evil demonic spirit sabotaging her work with the group. In the early hours of January 10th, she approached her sleeping daughter and ended her life with the blade of a pair of scissors to the neck. She then hid the scissors under her pillow and went back to sleep, until being woken by other family members. When her family saw what she'd done, the police were called and Li Guirong was taken into custody. In disturbing echoes of the Wan Chengyan case in 1996, during the interrogation, Li Guirong displayed no remorse or guilt, seemingly convinced she'd done the right thing. As with Wan Chengyan, 15 years prior, after months of psychological evaluation, Li Guirong was found to have limited liability due to being brainwashed by an illegal cult organization, and on August 16, 2011, was sentenced to 15 years in prison, where she would undergo extensive deprogramming. Mi Yongjun was said to be extremely familiar with the case, and after attacking the 85-year-old villager, he decided, like Li Guirong, to attempt to stop the demonic forces while they were still young and not yet strong. Despite no one's life being ended during the attack, the judiciary stated his intent was to take the lives of others and decided to charge him with intentional homicide, leaving him facing the death penalty. On December 13, 2013, Mi Yongjun was found guilty to the charges of intentional homicide and was sentenced to death. However, his defense immediately lodged an appeal against the judgment, pointing to previous cases where people under the influence of an illegal cult organization were given lighter punishments. The appeal was heard on September 16, 2014, and was rejected, with the original punishment being upheld. However, it wouldn't be the end of the legal disputes. Eventually, the case reached China's Supreme Court, which, after looking over further psychological evaluation of Mi Yongjun, ordered a retrial with new judges. On November 9, 2015, the new trial took place, and while the original punishment was upheld, this time it came with a 2-year suspension and the possibility the punishment could be commuted to life, with the further ruling that life would indeed mean life. The case would be discussed in court one more time on April 3, 2018, with the legitimacy of the sentence once again being examined. Ultimately, it was decided Mi Yongjun couldn't be held fully responsible for his actions at the time the crime was committed, and therefore the death sentence was unreasonably harsh. Instead, he was handed a life sentence, with the possibility of the punishment being further commuted based on the behavior Mi Yongjun displayed while incarcerated, and how well he responded to the psychological rehabilitation program he was ordered to undergo. The December of 2012 passed, and obviously the world didn't end. But despite the supposed prophecy of the female Christ failing to come to fruition, it did little to harm the continued growth of Eastern Lightning. The absence of the apocalypse was simply hand-waved as the female Christ changing her mind. However, the increase in tragic incidents and the very public displays of support for the church saw the authorities once again attempt to crack down on the organization, with thousands of followers being detained as police chased the leaders. This would lead to changes in tactics when it came to indoctrinating new members and efforts to make the organization appear a legitimate religious movement being unfairly persecuted in mainland China. Management of the mainland China operation would now be handed to the national manager taking care of the growth of the church in South Korea, working alongside the person running the church in Hong Kong. Establishing itself in Korea, the Church of the Almighty God had reportedly purchased the Utopia Youth Hostel in Gangwon Province, in the northeast of the country, to use as their headquarters. They were also said to be operating under an alternative name, something the organization would do with increasing frequency while they tried to spread overseas. In South Korea, they were reported to be operating under the name Aishan Jiaohui, meaning Arrow's Church. Furthermore, the church had no issues with operating openly in Hong Kong, the special administrative region being much more welcoming to such groups regardless of their beliefs or activities. Zhao Weishan and the church allegedly began spending 10 million yuan, around 1.4 million USD annually, on advertising in the Hong Kong media, along with setting up street stalls selling church materials, and registering an official business in efforts to promote the organization. The business initially registered the name Kingdom New Era in early 2013, but then changed it to Age of Kingdom Church Limited, and then to Church of Almighty God Limited. The church was granted tax exemption status in Hong Kong, claiming itself to be a charitable organization, something it also achieved in the United States in 2016. Being more open, however, brought with it issues for the group, with journalists interested in looking into the supposed religious movement which had both an extremely negative reputation in the mainland and was also being complained about by pastors of more traditional Christian places of worship in Hong Kong. Reporters went undercover to church gatherings to see for themselves what the much more visible church was teaching, how they recruited members, and investigated the group's financial records. What became abundantly clear was that the church targeted vulnerable people, mostly women, and did whatever they could to isolate new members from their families. This was seemingly confirmed by pastors of legitimate Christian churches, who told the media husbands were coming to them with increasing frequency, saying their wives were spending significantly less time at home, sometimes being away for days on what they said were religious retreats. The Church of the Almighty God had initially struggled to spread in Hong Kong, largely thanks to the language barrier. During the early days of the group's presence in the region, it was introduced by women moving from the mainland after following Technique 8 of paving the way and marrying local men. However, the Eastern Lightning followers moving to Hong Kong mostly spoke Mandarin, rather than the much more common Cantonese spoken by the locals. A combination of the Eastern Lightning followers residing in Hong Kong for several years learning Cantonese, and the money Zhao Weishan decided to invest in heavily promoting the church there, finally saw significant growth in membership. But with the extremely public 2014 attack on Wu Shuoyan going viral, resulting with Eastern Lightning gaining unprecedented attention internationally, wanting to avoid media scrutiny and waiting for the negative attention to blow over, the church effectively disappeared from public view around Hong Kong. And while the media coverage in the immediate aftermath of the incident cast the group as an obvious cult organization, eventually some attempted to whitewash its reputation. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed the video, please consider giving it a like, leaving a comment, and subscribing to the channel. And the third and final part of this story is coming soon.